Welcome to Podkey Left and Right, where today the through line is credibility under pressure. A lot of these stories look unrelated at first glance, but they keep landing on the same question when institutions, campaigns, leagues, or investigators ask for trust. What have they actually done to earn it? The John List case is one of those reminders that the clean story a killer tells about himself can fall apart on contact with boring details. The confirmed facts are brutal and methodical. In 1971, List murdered his wife, mother, and 3 children, staged the house, wrote a confession, lowered the thermostat, stopped deliveries, managed the mail, moved money, took bonds, and left his car at JFK with ID visible, so investigators would chase the idea that he fled abroad. What matters analytically is that the deception wasn't genius in some cinematic sense. It was administrative. He understood how much of modern life runs on assumptions created by paperwork, timing, and routine. Investigators later reconstructed the crime the same way, not through a dramatic breakthrough at first, but through contradictions, a phone call, a cancelled soccer practice, autopsies that did not match his account, John Jr. fighting back so hard that the idea List spared his family awareness becomes very hard to defend. That matters because serial frauds and family annihilators often try to preserve one last claim to moral control. List wanted to be seen as desperate, maybe even grimly principled in his own mind. The physical evidence cut against that. Then there's the second act. He reappears as Bob Clark, socially respectable, church-adjacent, financially trusted, exactly the kind of man many communities are trained not to scrutinize too closely. That's not just irony, it's a warning about how institutions allocate trust. He had prior theft issues and still repeatedly landed in roles handling money. Respectability became camouflage. The most interesting twist is that mass media eventually did what ordinary investigation couldn't. Frank Bender's sculpted bust, broadcast to a huge audience, prompted the tip that connected Bob Clark back to List. That doesn't mean media spectacle is inherently reliable. Usually it's the opposite. But here, a carefully grounded public-facing image broke the case. So the lesson isn't that media is good or bad, it's that publicity works when it's tethered to disciplined forensic reasoning. And the hidden wealth angle at Breeze Knoll sharpens the tragedy. If valuables were there that List never understood, then his story of financial doom becomes even weaker. Desperation may have been real to him, but that doesn't make his diagnosis of reality accurate. The Fauci story needs a distinction that too much public debate refuses to make. One claim is about transparency, the other is about vaccine safety. They are not the same claim, and collapsing them together creates more heat than light. The released 2021 messages reportedly show Fauci privately discussing theoretical pregnancy-related risks tied to fever or immune response after a second mRNA dose while speaking more reassuringly in public. If that's the record, then the strongest criticism is about informed consent and overconfidence. A public health official does not need to prove vaccines are dangerous in order to have communicated badly. He only needs to have downplayed uncertainty that reasonable people would have wanted disclosed. At the same time, the larger studies cited here, involving roughly 100,000 to 150,000 pregnancies, did not show elevated miscarriage risk after COVID vaccination. That undercuts the much bigger and much less supported claim that officials hid mass pregnancy harm. So the better supported position is narrower but still serious. Transparency failures can be real even when the worst underlying allegation is false. The Fifth Amendment fight and contempt push add another layer, but legally that terrain is messier than partisan clips suggest. People treat a pardon as if it automatically wipes out all self-incrimination risk. It may not, especially if state exposure remains conceivable. The broader institutional problem is the habit of presenting contested judgments as settled science. That can buy short-term compliance. It also burns trust reserves fast, and once those are gone, people start treating every correction as proof of a cover-up. That's where conspiratorial ecosystems gain market share, not because every conspiracy is true, but because official communicators train the audience to expect selective candor. On women's sports, the hardest thing for institutions to admit is that rules here really do require exclusion somewhere. That sounds harsh, but roster-limited competition has to decide who qualifies. Once performance differences track biological sex in meaningful ways, the issue stops being symbolic and becomes material. Spots, scholarships, trophies, contracts, and Title IX opportunities are finite. The WNBA pressure tests are useful precisely because they expose ambiguity. When public figures announce mock entries to force the question, they're not proving a loophole can be exploited tomorrow. They are showing that unclear language eventually invites a stress test. Supporters of strict eligibility rules frame this as fairness and legal protection for female athletes. Opponents emphasize inclusion and non-discrimination. Both values are real, but they are not perfectly compatible in every competitive setting. That's why vague branding around inclusion tends to fail. If the policy is collectively bargained and complex, say that. If the rule is sex-based for competitive reasons, say that. If there are carve-outs, say that too. What doesn't hold up well is the idea that institutions can preserve trust by staying fuzzy. They usually can't. Ambiguity just shifts the fight from a principled disagreement about criteria to a procedural fight about whether leaders are dodging the criteria entirely. The flashpoint incidents around league discipline and rhetoric matter less as isolated scandals than as accelerants. They make every unresolved policy question feel partisan and selective, even when the underlying issue is actually rule design. The argument about Woke 2.0 is really an argument about whether progressive politics is changing clothes or changing content. The proposed distinction is that the earlier phase centered systemic racism and white supremacy, while the newer phase increasingly names capitalism, private property, and markets as the root problem. That shift matters because economic pain is easier to scale politically than academic moral language. High prices, housing stress, AI anxiety, debt, and wage pressure create a broader entry point than campus-style discourse ever did. So the claim that a more anti-capitalist left could be politically durable is plausible. But plausibility is not proof. Progressive primary strength does not automatically translate into general election strength. Michigan and Wisconsin examples show real energy, but also polling volatility, turnout composition problems, and the fact that influencer-friendly candidates still have to persuade older, rural, and less ideological voters. That's why the skepticism toward rhetorical pivots from figures like AOC is understandable. If a politician laughs off past excesses without naming what was wrong, voters can reasonably suspect a messaging adjustment rather than a substantive rethink. Still, critics should be careful too. Calling everything socialism does not answer the economic grievance underneath it. If housing is unaffordable and groceries are punishing families, voters are going to demand more than an abstract defense of markets. The strongest pro-market response in the source material is not chest-thumping about capitalism as a brand. It's concrete supply-side repair, loosen zoning, remove tariffs, distinguish cronyism from real competition, and make ownership feel reachable again. That persuasion point is underrated. Markets can generate prosperity at scale and still lose politically if everyday life feels like insecurity, extraction, and gatekeeping. People don't live inside GDP per capita charts. They live inside rent, food, and debt payments. Across crime, politics, medicine, and sports, the recurring failure is usually not disagreement itself. It's leaders asking for confidence while hiding the rule, softening the uncertainty, or pretending the rebrand is the substance. This is Podkey Left and Right. Thanks for listening. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.